Is there another stage in this banking agenda that brings it into a more global arena?
Well, that's a good question because, yes, there is actually. J.P. Morgan and his Secret Seven formed the Federal Reserve System, and J.P. Morgan also formed the Bank of International Settlements, hiding obviously behind various people, but it was J.P. Morgan, all right, and that took us back in link to the European bankers who are in league with the American bankers. One of the things the Bank of International Settlements was designed for, we were told, was war reparations, and it is true to say that they paid the Allies 86 billion over a period of time. However, Germany borrowed from the Bank of International Settlements £138 billion. This resulted in the formation of the Third Reich. The world wars that we've had, when you look at them, are very straightforward. World War One bankers are known, who were behind the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and all that occurred, bringing in World War One. They profited from that war, and then later on at Versailles they arranged World War Two. Now this is in the book. World War Two was in fact paid for and organised and structured from 120 to 140 Broadway, New York. So what you've got in the Bank of International Settlements is the hiring of Hitler, the paying of Hitler, the funding of the Third Reich, and the bank was formed in 1930 and went straight at forming the Third Reich. And then the link up with American industry, American with a small a because we're dealing with the same Lombard influences, the supply to the Third Reich of aircraft parts, vehicles, fuel throughout the whole of the war, and so on and so forth. So we've got an international bank, as well as finding 138 billion for Hitler and knowing what would happen anyway. They knew exactly what was going to happen because they planned it. But having done that, they also provided Swiss gold for Hitler just to make sure that there was enough money in the pot. The Dawes and Young arrangements actually go back simply to J.P. Morgan. And in the Dawes and Young plan, which was basically war reparations, but it turned out not to be the same thing at all, was Fritz Thyssen, who equipped the Nazi Party in conjunction, as I said, with Broadway. And one or two of the names like Avril Harriman and Prescott Bush will be known to people that worked with Fritz Thyssen, making sure that Hitler came not only to power, but to dominant power in Europe. We have to say of the Bank of International Settlements, because we are simply dealing with something that needs evaluating, that after the outbreak of World War II, it was the Bank of International Settlements that took into its vaults the stolen gold from all over Europe. Eventually, after a lot of comment and action, they released and gave back a mere £4 million, but they took into their coffers the gold of Europe. This included 44 assignments of gold from Auschwitz, where they knowingly melted down the gold teeth of the Jews and spectacles and cigarette cases and the like. The people concerned in doing that were later employed by the Rockefeller interests in America. So the Bank of International Settlements went straight in, really, to become a criminal endeavour. What happened after World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, was that the American president and many others and other countries said that the Bank of International Settlements would be closed at once for war crimes. By whatever process of international law, the people running the Bank of International Settlements ensured that they could not be got at by the law of any nation. So they remained above anything that could be done to them personally. And although it was decided by all the nations that the BIS would close, in fact, as you know, it didn't close. It just kept its head down and kept going, and now is in a dominant position organising the structures of the G7.
So why was nobody able to touch the Bank of International Settlements after World War II, when the evidence against them was so obviously damning?
Well, because the bankers got to the international law before anybody else. What I can tell you about the Bank of International Settlements is that it was founded as a private organisation. It's privately owned. It was founded by questionable people, which will include the J.P. Morgan arrangements. It accounts to absolutely nobody. Its books are closed. It operates secretly, and it is inviolate. It is above the law and beyond prosecution. Its money movements are in fact hidden, so once you get into international markets you can't tell what it's doing with the money, although you can be sure it's profiting. It does still target regional currencies, and it is the agent looking to global currency. Now, when you say, how did they achieve this? They achieved it simply by international law. One of the things that I've said in my book is that national law must begin to override international law. We've got to begin to get back moral governments, moral nations, and be able to act as free and reasonable and decent people again.
So what is the present arrangements with the Bank of International Settlements?
Well, in 2003, the Bank of International Settlements abandoned the gold Swiss franc, which it has had underpinning its activities since 1930, and it developed a paper system, can you believe, called special drawing rights. It's based really upon currencies such as the yen, the pound and the dollar, but gold no longer backs currencies. Central banks are private. So this is a sort of step towards an international paper currency. We've already seen how that paper currency has affected the world. We've seen how it affected the Bank of England to start with. Now we're beginning to look at a world paper currency, again founded by questionable people. And the problem with this paper currency is that nations that are linked to this system can simply start printing paper money. And so from 2003 onward we are faced with a new form of currency which I think is extremely unhealthy, and people like the Conservative Party in Britain, who are busy ensuring that Britain doesn't get involved in the euro for very good reason, are suddenly going to find that somebody stepped around behind them and produced special drawing rights, the new currency for the whole globe. There's no doubt about it that they're really trying to create now a world currency with world implications for anybody who gets caught up in it.
We've talked about individual banks, but is there some way that we can define the movement?
Well, yes, we can, and some of what I have to say may be a little surprising, but nevertheless I have done my research. This group in the Eastern Mediterranean, where it all began, was actually involved in banking and in trading with sword in hand, so there's a war-making side to it. And they were prepared to get involved in anything from looting to opium dealing. Actually, you're beginning to look at a group of people who are diametrically opposed to Christianity. They didn't like the Holy Roman Empire, and they didn't like Christians. They didn't care for Jews either, and that, again, is another story. So begins a group which moves up into Europe, bringing with it much the same kind of baggage. So what they do is they plan 120 years before they act, so that when an event occurs, the people who planned it are already dead. And as you know, it's rather difficult to arrest anybody who's been dead for that long, and that's how they operate. When they close in on a nation, they start to unpick the education. Remember Karl Marx, but he was run by very rich people. Finance, which of course we've talked about in broad outline, knowing what they want, which is a world currency. Religion, because they operate in an occult way through occult red masonry, and therefore they have a vested interest in ensuring that religion is removed. And politics, which they can often move to the extreme right, which then results in a war which they have caused, and invariably they will be on both sides. So we're dealing with a structure which has remained, first of all, hidden by the cunning and deceit that it practices, and secondly, which has been written out of history by the Round Table. If you were to take an example of that, Lord Shelburne of Bowood in the 18th century, he actually caused the French Revolution. He did it on behalf of the Lombard bankers, and the stories of the French Revolution ever since have been nonsense. He rewrote history. And then you move on another couple of hundred years, you've got a Mr. Beer, who was employed specifically to write out of history the American War of Independence and the Civil War and much else besides. So you've got a group which will quietly move in on a country, and suddenly you'll find a deterioration. The actual occult groups they've got are based upon something called the Eleusinian mystery religion, which came from 15 BC Athens, was adopted first by the Romans and then by these Lombards as a secret trading base, so they could set up this seemingly religious group in any country they wanted, but it would of course be serving them, and its inner workings are pagan and occult. So when you get the occult showing in a particular country, you find the church having a difficult time, you may be sure that the presence of the Lombard has returned, as it has frequently done so in history.
So can you say more about the occult?
Well, yes, I can. We go back to 15 BC, and there is the Eleusinian mystery religion. And that religion is quite likely to follow any of the pagan gods, so you don't actually have to pin it down too closely. And this was a very precious instrument of trade, because wherever you put it, you could trade from that base, but also it was a secret society, and therefore much of what you did could be excluded from public view. And the Lombards took on this system with huge enthusiasm, and wherever they went, they took with them the Eleusinian mystery religion. Now I can point to various little bits of our history, and you will find the EMR being mentioned. Now, for instance, the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris, which has had quite an effect on causing wars, is based on the EMR. The Hellfire Clubs, which instigated the War of Independence, are based upon the EMR. And this EMR then became the agent that polluted the Knights Templar. As I said, the Knights Templar were employed by the Lombard bankers. So now you've got the EMR inside the Templars, who then assist the Lombards to increase their empire in the Eastern Mediterranean and then invade Britain through the four lodges that I've talked about. So you've got EMR lodges, Templar lodges, right inside a growing democracy and within a Christian nation. So now you begin to play with words, and you could use the word Templar, you could use the word Rosicrucian, you can use the word EMR, all to explain exactly the same thing. And if you look at the 6 wars that I have described, you will find that Templar Red Masonry is the agency being used to disrupt countries under the surface. You can move on a little bit from this broad occultism to see it linking with lesser groups and smaller groups in the community and encouraging them to be occult, because this is really based on the Lombard process. But I have defined the rites and the processes whereby Red Masonry is used as a support for the banking movement. And basically most Freemasons are in the blue degrees, the first 3 degrees, but this system operates in the higher Templar degrees. I do assure you that the central column of the banking movement has, since 697 AD, had a very firm occult and pagan group attached to it. One of the central groups that belong to this banking system is called the Fratres Lucis, or the Brotherhood of Light. Other people over the ages have called it the Illuminati, and they don't know what the Illuminati is. But Fratres Lucis has always belonged firmly to the Lombard cause and to the East India Company, and it is basically the EMR secret society. It is very distinctive because it objected to St. John of Patmos, who wrote the Book of Revelation, against the powers and principalities of this world, against Babylon and Rome. And so what they did was to basically use the letters of St. John to the 7 churches in Asia and use it as their title. So the second title for the Fratres Lucis is the 7 churches of Asia. What I can tell you is that anybody who joins the Fratres Lucis, although they're probably going to join Masonry and then get siphoned off into the Fratres Lucis, will be initiated using the words from the Book of Revelation. When the East India Company was at its height of power, they called it the John Company. Moving on from that, they've got a form of Masonry attached to the Fratres Lucis, which is called Armageddon Masonry. And what that has done is to plan 6 wars. Actually, they've planned 7, but they've had 6. And so part of the book is to define this progress of the Lombards through finance and through aggression in their conquest of what I think we might call the free world. And it's been done to a very specific plan. Around 1711 they had worked out, roughly speaking, the 7 wars that they were going to have. We've had 6. Although it sounds unlikely, and people are going to say, well, I can't really believe that, just look up the Freemasons Dictionary by A.E. Waite.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it.